excess capacity, and we make considerations if you don't. But this is saying you don't have to build that into four units per acre, but a developer has the right to do that. You can't take that right away from them simply because you want huge parcels and huge lots. I don't know that we ever got the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So last year when we were working on housing, one of the surprises to me was to hear from some developers that they, even if there wasn't town water and sewer, that they felt like it was faster and in the end less expensive for them to just go ahead and take care of that themselves as part of like a site specific, like, I don't know what to call it, like a sort of a mini community of septic system that can use water.
Yeah.
Did that come up? I mean, that was a surprise to me. Like, it wasn't, I had expected everything to land where we'd already built the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Well, no, sometimes we'd actually rather go elsewhere.
Well, I mean, this bill has some so when we look at our, okay, we're really zoomed in, so that's good. When we look at some of our, we have just a few changes or exemptions outside of our designated areas and outside of our municipal water and sewer areas, where we also know people want to build and have, the ability to have septic capacity and other things. And then duplexing by right is throughout the state in this bill. So Ellen has some really beautiful charts about where we're saying only on municipal water and sewer, where we're saying everywhere you can have some of these changes. And the everywhere part is, well, if you have the septic capacity to do that, you can do that as well. And we know there's a lot of money coming in for upgrading or building new water and sewer infrastructure. And this is a great time to say, we're giving you lots of new money and we really want to achieve some density with that. But
IIJA money, that's really the big shot in the arm for building out that kind of infrastructure.
That's what I understand that of all the acronyms. Yes, it's not Inflation Reduction Act, it's the one that came after. The other thing I want to say, just specific to being in this committee, is we have guiding principles for a just transition that sort of overlaid the entire work of the Climate Council. I know you've talked a lot about that in here. And it has principles like solidarity and the most impacted first and supporting workers and families. The point of this bill is to have people have access to safe, warm housing near where they work. That is a climate change goal I think we share. And I think we all have anecdotal stories of climate immigrants coming to Vermont, getting second homes, buying the big single family houses and saying, I'm going to keep this as an insurance policy in case Washington, D.C. gets too hot or Florida goes underwater or whatever the case may be. If that housing all disappears, we have nothing left for the climate refugees that come next. And we have nothing left for the workforce. And although that's generally something we worry about every day in economic development, if we have thousands and thousands of open jobs and less than 1,000 units of housing, so we're looking at maybe 24,000 open jobs in the state, less than 1,000 units altogether listed from what we can see available, many of those not in our job centers. We can't build our climate workforce. We can't build our mental health workforce. We have 1,300 open jobs at UVM Medical Center. We have multiple crises on our hands related to not having the workforce that we need to do the work. And for me, that goes back to making sure that this transition is just and it meets everyone's needs. So leave that with you. The other thing I feel like we've heard a lot about that I wanted to touch on when it comes to that Act 250 pieces and things that are, certainly you hear about every year. We hear about every year, but we don't always touch in our committee is, if everyone's having a housing crisis, why do we have to look at our policies uniquely? Why is this about us? And I think, you probably hear the same thing about climate change. If everybody's in this climate crisis together, why should we be this drop in the bucket? Why should we change what we're doing? We're only adding, Vermont at the top end of the estimate is looking to add 40,000 units of housing in the next 10 years, which is quite a bit for us. But when you look at the broad scheme of things, why should we build that housing instead of Texas or somewhere that's frankly having a lot of infrastructure and energy crises? And it's, it's the reality that every state is looking at what their policies uniquely prohibit and where they have a responsibility to help others. And as I said before, when you talk about a climate crisis and us having some of the most ideal counties to live in per some different studies and reports, we're going to be on a migration pattern north. And so when we look at that 40,000, it does include figures for climate immigration. And so we might be a drop in the bucket, but we're going to be a really important one. We're at the end of every zombie movie of like the place to go. And so, you know,
A place with water, a place with reasonable, well, anyway,
that we deal with our weather infrastructure, you know, needs well also.
turns out we're also a crucial migration corridor for critters.
Exactly. Yes. And we're going to have to figure out both together.
Can I ask a quick question on 40,000?
Mhm.
So if the population didn't change at all, what's the net, how many units of housing would we be looking for? And then 40,000 anticipates how many more people perhaps arriving, and this was a 10-year out figure.
Yeah. Well, it has some. I think if you look 10 years out versus 5 years out, you might be talking about different numbers. Vermont Housing Finance Agency are the ones looking at that broad number, and they have the best data. I mean, if you go to housingdata.org, which is our state resource per VHFA's work, you're able to see in every community how much the housing stock has or hasn't grown, what percentage of the population lives near work or has to commute out for work. So Maura, if you have her in the witness chair, could speak more to where that number comes from. We went through the breakdown, and I don't want to misrepresent how much of a percentage was climate immigration versus what we need to do right now. I would say that in addition to that job ratio figure, you know, the two other figures that I keep close at hand, and, you know, Joyce Manchester did our economic presentation for JFO, is that 70% of Vermonters are living in households of 2 people or less. So in the sections that may not pertain to you as much, but duplexing certainly does, quadruplexing, we start to talk about, you know, home sharing and options for getting huge houses that have huge energy bills full with more people where there already is the capacity for those large families that don't often exist anymore or are waiting to come here.
Sure. I see that in Crystal, you know, lots of nice bigger older homes.
Mm-hmm.
Some are still just a couple people or one person, and others apartments.
Exactly. We're about to go from a 2 to 3 person home, but you probably hear from a lot of people who say we're already in a tight apartment and we have a baby on the way and there is nowhere for us to go. We heard in our housing hearing from people living in motels, which just are not ideal places for people to live for this long. And so that third metric that we've been keeping close at hand is just about the homelessness crisis, that we've gone from the average length of homelessness being 50 days before the pandemic to 270. And we have to get that number back down. Some of you may know Rick DeAngelis at the Good Samaritan House, you know, with all the overcrowding and chaos. I don't want to blame any one factor, but, you know, his son was just stabbed 2 nights ago and left in critical condition. I mean, the people on the front lines of this housing crisis are holding on by a thread as well. And we have to keep that in mind because we have the highest rate of change in homelessness in the country right now. And it shows with our small scale otherwise. As I said, Ellen presented, you know, we'll probably present, if it's of value to the committee, some beautiful summaries of the full bill, as well as where the Act 250 provisions would apply, and on the local level where we're talking about all residential districts versus ones with certified municipal water and sewer. I just want to, you know, so we can touch local zoning, which you heard has inflamed other stakeholders in the process. And, you know, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, others you may hear from have said, we want to be able to talk about where the state has responsibility for duplication. And we looked long and hard at that and what our responsibility is in our designated areas and growth centers. I do want to point out too, when we talk about homelessness, we looked at local zoning as it relates to making sure shelters can operate and motels can operate as shelters and make sure they're not pushed further and further out of transportation corridors and places where they need to function for the hours and seasons that they need to operate. There's a provision in here that's uniquely yours also to to look at on the energy code and, you know, whether or not we want to look at the cost of new energy code requirements in certain communities and how those impact the price of housing. There are others who came to us and said, couldn't we use certain incentives in Act 250 and others to give you fast tracking or, you know, a higher level of approval if you have better, you know, future infrastructure for reducing fossil fuel use, et cetera. That's something in your time with the bill you may want to look at. But I think, you know, we looked at Act 250 not only as, you know, what is the timeline of the process for both projects, small in our rural communities and large, our priority housing projects in our downtowns, but what are the projects that don't happen because people have just gone through their local process and all of their habitat and, you know, stormwater and wetland permits, and then they're going through a process again and they're kind of experiencing double jeopardy with the same people are going to appeal their project again, and they're going to deal with that uncertainty, so they scale back the density of their project, which isn't good for a housing crisis and it's not good for the environment. So I guess just to end, you know, it's become really clear to our committee that every single rung of the ladder is overcrowded, that people want to move into the state and take a job and can't, and they're in our motels and or otherwise leaving again and saying this won't work for me. You know, there are people living on the streets or in their cars who want access to the motels. There are people in the motels who desperately want to rent something and move out of a one-bedroom motel that they've been in for far too long. There are people who are renting who really want to be homeowners and stay here permanently. And I want to remind us all that the greatest thing we can do to close the wealth gap in the country is give people access to homeownership, and that's both of our responsibilities, because, you know, having stability income-wise also makes you more climate resilient. And then those who own a home, you know, some want to downsize and they want what we might call a starter home as an ender home. And those ender home folks are taking the starter homes from the people who want to become homeowners for the first time. So we looked at every piece of the housing continuum. We tried not to blame one piece of it for this crisis. We just have a lot of work to do to make sure that those rungs of the ladder get less crowded and people can find a place, a safe and warm place near work to live in the state.
Well, thank you. I know that, you know, we, for years, I think there is some people like think of the relationship between the two committees as contentious, and I think, yeah, there are points of contention with this, but to me, there's a much more profound shared interest in smart growth,
Exactly.
which brings us all together in terms of how we use the environment, how the energy impacts, walkable places to live, all that.
If we all believe that the climate crisis is only going to worsen regardless of our best efforts, and major cities go underwater and places heat up, we won't be able to control as much of the impact to our state when the bigger crises hit, and we will hope we've done good work to make space and capacity available for people to come here. So I think believing that climate crisis means building human infrastructure.
Remind us a little bit, so what's your, I don't know if it's possible to summarize, but how often do you find municipal planning and zoning that prevents anything more dense than a single family? Or the 4 units per acre zoning? I mean, is the biggest challenge at the moment rules that prevent making village centers, towns, et cetera, more dense?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't ask VLCT to fully survey their members. We heard from a lot of town planners, our witnesses, just I believe over 100 people long, and we can get that to you. And we listened to a lot of planners, some of whom have already quietly allowed for duplexing by right. You know, some of whom have, I mean, all of whom have an ADU program up and running because of our work in the past couple of years. A lot of them use their growth centers or their village center as the kind of focal point for growth. And a lot of them are hitting those priority housing caps in their major, you know, growth areas, their downtowns, et cetera. and want to grow further. But every planner, had a slightly different story, but said they are all trying to add more thoughtful smart growth principles and get more triplexes and quadruplexes developed. There was a 5 per acre density requirement. We heard a lot about that. Berry Town, South Burlington, etc. We took it down to 4 per acre, which I said to Senator Cummings, in my mind is like a home in a barn. You can have single family home in a triplex and it looks like the shape of, a lot of our landscape here on an acre. And that's again where we have municipal water and sewer, which when you look at these growth areas, as Commissioner Hanford can tell you, it's about 41 square miles of our 9,600 square miles in the state. And it's a place that, people are looking at how do we do this in the right way? And what do we do while we have money coming our way for water and sewer?
So do you end up examining expanding growth areas? When I've heard people say that they're too small, that we're sort of outgrowing our growth centers. Can you talk about how provisions to make them any larger, support more development in those centers? I mean, not only densifying, but making them large.
That certainly came up, and if we were looking at full map, which either way, we love that map and we used it a lot last day for this bill. But, one of the things that struck us was just having more of them. There's maybe only 4 to 5 of the larger designated growth areas around our bigger population centers. And for all intents and purposes, those seem to be functioning fairly well. And I think if you said, this is the area where you get, faster process where your community, and I want to say, in most contexts with Act 250, we're not saying no longer do these criteria apply. We're saying the local community can apply to have the power to help community projects meet the criteria. And so if they're, saying, wow, I have to go through one process and meet all the criteria instead of 2 where I could be exposed to multiple appeals, you might see people really look more with more anticipation at their growth areas and the designated areas in general. So, I think you may have heard this, but when we said, is this the cart before the horse? Because we have studies, this was, let's be the horse. Let's say these designated areas mean something. They mean you can go to the Natural Resources Board and ask for the designation to do this work yourselves. And that might really steer what comes out of these studies and reports about what it means to have these designated areas and how valuable that could be for a community.
Sure. And we did, I don't know what to call it, liberalizing the Act 250 provisions around priority housing projects last session. So it's the core of what we're talking about, to expand it just to beyond housing, or we say a little about how people might step out of Act 250 and rely on another thing, like a local planning process.
Yeah. So
what lets you out of, I don't want to say this, what lets you go into an alternative way of being reviewed as opposed to traditional Act 250?
Right. Anywhere we lifted caps or raised caps, like anywhere we lifted them entirely or raised them, was specifically for housing. Most of the work we did to lift caps entirely was exclusive to priority housing projects in our largest growth areas. You heard perhaps in the governor's speech the Middlebury example of just being under the population threshold where you're capped at 75 and they want to do a big project where Middlebury College exists and there's certainly the knowledge that you have populations that come and go and expand and contract. And so we looked at starting a conversation with you all about lifting all the caps because there's still a lot of other constraints that will hem in. Okay, well, priority housing being mixed use or having a large percentage affordable, you're still talking about, needed projects in communities that will be constrained by local capacity. And then we did, we heard a lot from the rural caucus in the House, and they certainly didn't want to be left behind in the bill. And anything you see outside of the designated areas is because they're saying, we haven't had the technical capacity to do all this work, but we also, when you look at 25 units in a 5-mile radius in 5 years, which is one of the only places we touch outside of the designated areas instead of 10, you're talking about infilling in a mobile home park plus developing 6 units of housing in the center of town. So anything you do within a 5-mile radius can start to hit a cap where you want to stay in your community and be the promoter of housing, be the one who's getting things developed and done. And people stay under that 10 unit cap right now because they are small operators. We heard from the smallest of small operators who said, I just can't afford any exposure in Act 250 because I'm this, guy in my living room who's trying to build housing in my community, and I'll have to wait or go somewhere else, which just promotes sprawl when I'd rather just do more units right here.
I hear anecdotal stories about 9-unit developments, 9-unit developments.
Yes, we heard a lot about that. If we could quantify that, it would be really helpful. Just how much density have we lost because people bump up against that, and it's not because it's an enemy, but because I had people who said, "Is this going to take me 2 years or forever?" And we don't have a good answer for that. So people give up, and we lose housing in major transportation corridors where it makes the most sense. It's on bus lines. My chiropractors are dealing with this on Route 7. I can't escape it, but everyone's not wanting to vilify Act 250, but seeing a lot of unknowns that they don't have the financial capacity to bear.
Any committee questions for Senator Rothman? Well, good to see you. Thank you for coming in. And this is a front burner bill for us.
Yes, and we really appreciate that as well. I think we both have been in Pro Tem's office talking about making sure when we go to town meeting day, we have some sense of, what to tell people on housing. And then the appropriations is another story.
There was, sort of hand in glove with this book, maybe this gets into eviction as well. There was an On the Media series on evictions. There's someone at Princeton who studies that. And it's like 4 parts, and it's a sad eye-opener.
Absolutely.
To listen to. That exists around the world of eviction.
Exactly. Yeah. If you dabble in other sections of the bill, we have an eviction rescue fund that has wraparound supports. We have first generation homebuyer grant continuation. We look to close the racial homeownership gap in the state, which you probably heard me say is the 5th largest in the country. And, right now, when we already know we have a housing crisis and inflation, and a lot of disparities, again, we probably have not had a wealth gap that's been this large in recent history, because if you own a home, that value of your stock went way up, and if you don't own a home, your rents went way up. So we have a real moral obligation to really close that income inequality and wealth inequality gap as well.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Godspeed, I will stay in touch.
With that, we'll go back to now. We'll go back to, we'll start. We'll start the review of S100. Let's do a line by line, so we know the whole thing. If you can then, not the entire bill. Let's just stick to the parts that our committee needs to look at. Sorry, I want to rephrase that. Focus. The parts that relate to municipal planning, whether it's municipal or active.
Okay, so today, posted on your website is the bill S100, but I also did submit one of the charts that Senator Ron Kinsale mentioned, which is the full summary chart of this bill. So this bill is 53 pages. Pages 1 through 32 are mine, in that I drafted them. And so they are largely land use related. There are a couple of sort of miscellaneous topics towards the end of that that are related to land use, so not either Act 250 or zoning. So I guess I did have a question though, because it's 32 pages. The first many pages are zoning. Did you want to start with Act 250?
So you gonna make sense, will the Act 250 make more sense if we just read through zoning?
No.
And sort of in order?
I did not do a municipal zoning primer this morning, was sort of what I was suggesting.
Well, I think, if I'm remembering right around zoning and, we look at things that ended up having like natural resource impacts, like water and sewer connections, river corridors, things like that. We didn't get involved in whether or not, I don't believe that we're talking about 4 units per acre or 5 units per acre or that kind of stuff. So I don't, maybe we can.
What do you mean? You don't want to talk about zoning, or you?
No, I'm just saying, I think prior years, I don't remember having discussions.
I do think you have jurisdiction over land use.
Yeah.
But
Right.
if you don't want it, that's fine too.
So how about, let's just read it a decent clip through and we'll see what we have and then we'll keep on moving.
Okay. Page 1, section 1. Section 1 amends 24 VSA 4414. This is in the municipal zoning chapter, and this first one is about parking. There's new language at the bottom of page 1. 4414.4 lays out that municipalities have the ability to adopt zoning requirements specific to how many parking spaces are required, and they are allowed to vary this by district and use. And so there's new language at the bottom of page 1 that says, for residential uses, a municipality shall not require more than 1 parking space per dwelling unit or accessory dwelling unit. However, a municipality may require 1.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit if the development is located more than 1/4 of a mile away from public parking, or the need for parking cannot be reasonably met through the use of on-street parking, public parking, or shared parking. Municipalities may round up to the nearest full parking space. It then goes on to say that for non-residential uses, the municipality still can make decisions about the number of parking spaces. So 1 parking space per unit of housing. It can go to 1.5 if there are parking constraints.
Environmental goodness will be a bonus, right? Less impervious surface per unit.
Yes, this is a pretty significant shift in some ways. Currently, towns have different metrics they use for the number of parking spaces that are required for new development. Some have a number per the number of bedrooms. Some have a number per the number per dwelling unit. And so there's a variety across the state of the number of parking spaces that towns require. But this is dropping it down for residential to 1 or 1.5 if there are constraints.
Wondering if I'm wondering if I should hold my questions till, like, is now the time to ask questions, or want to just burn through a lot of this?
How about we flag stuff and
Okay.
burn through and then double back? I mean, just think it's always helpful to big picture. So we dig in.
Flag up around it, we can come back to it.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
All right, section 2 is one of the largest sections of this bill in terms of substance. Section 2 amends 24 VSA 4412, which is another one of the sections in chapter 117 that puts guardrails around what types of zoning bylaws municipalities can adopt. So on page 3, currently under statute, municipalities are required to provide at least 1 zoning district where multifamily or multi-unit dwellings are allowed, but it only has to be 1 place. That language is at the top of page 3. And now new language is being added below it, starting on line 4, which reads, in any district that allows year-round residential development, duplexes shall be an allowed use. with the same dimensional standards as single unit dwelling. And any district that is served by municipal water and sewer, or sewer and water infrastructure that allows residential development, multi-unit dwellings with 4 or fewer units shall be an allowed use. Senator Rob Hinsdale did just preview that. This is duplexes by right, essentially. And where there is water and sewer infrastructure, the town must allow up to 4 units. And further down, I think on the next page, we'll get to what that means with sewer and water infrastructure. The next topic in this section on page 3, subdivision E is what is described, which is the definition of accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units are a concept within zoning where there is an additional living unit added to an existing single-family dwelling. That unit is subordinate and needs to be smaller than the single-family unit, up to 30% of the size or 900 square feet, whichever is greater. And the municipalities have to allow for the construction of 1 accessory dwelling unit per single-family unit.
Certainly not.
Subdivision like add on to the end of the house or divide up within the house?
Either. It can be within the existing house or appurtenant to, so it could be a garage apartment or a carriage house.
Mother-in-law suite.
So yeah, so 30 years ago, in 1992, this law was adopted as the sort of mother-in-law apartment. And at that time, this language, which is fairly similar to what was adopted 30 years ago, did require that a blood relative live in the apartment. Yes. Wow. This is a really interesting topic historically to discuss, but we don't really object to that. But I'd be happy to discuss because there is a really interesting tension in this bill because is an ADU a duplex? Is it different than a duplex? But minor changes are being made to the definition of ADU here. So first on line 12 into 13, currently the law says a bylaw may require a an ADU to be subject to the same review as a single family unit. It is being strengthened to say it shall be the same standard of review. And then additionally, the criteria for conversion of an existing detached non-residential building, so like a garage or a barn, to habitable space for an accessory dwelling unit shall not be more restrictive than the criteria used for a single family dwelling without an ADU. Next, on page 4, subdivision H is one of the provisions related to the homeless shelters. So no bylaw, page 4, line 7, no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting or penalizing a hotel from renting rooms that provide housing assistance to the state of Vermont's general assistance program or to any person whose room is rented with public funds. The term hotel has the same meaning as in 32 BSA 9202. All right, sections 12 and 13 have some big concepts in them as well. So first, subdivision 12. In any district served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure that allows residential development, bylaws shall establish lot and building dimensional standards that allow 4 or more dwelling units per acre for each allowed residential use. The density standards for multi-unit dwellings shall not be more restrictive than those required for single-family dwellings. So, in addition to what I talked about on the prior page, in areas where there is sewer and water, the town has to allow 4 units per acre. It doesn't specify how they achieve that. It can be a mix of single-family units, or it could be duplexes, or it could be a fourplex, because those are also allowed by right in areas with sewer and water. All right, subdivision 13. In any district served by municipal sewer and water infrastructure that allows residential development, any mixed-use developments and affordable housing, as defined in the chapter, may exceed building height limitations by 1 additional habitable floor beyond the maximum height, and using that additional floor may exceed density limitations for residential developments by an additional 40%, provided that the structure complies with Vermont Fire and Building Safety Code. So what this sort of looks like, and I guess the 40% now is a little bit weirder, but previously the thought had been, because 5 units per acre were required, if someone was building affordable housing and the town had a limit on 3-story buildings, this would potentially allow a building to be 4 stories. If they then use that 4th story for an additional 40%, which would be an additional 2 units. And the math gets a little bit clearer once you're talking about larger apartment developments.
Going up.
Yes.
How smart to me.
On page 5, subdivision 14, no bylaw shall have the effect of limiting the square footage of a duplex that otherwise complies with the applicable building code. So a lot of what we talked about in the last few sections relates to treating duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes the same as a single family unit would be treated. Subsection 15 adds this, takes a different turn here and is really defining what is meant by sewer and water infrastructure. So this section gives the town the ability to define their sewer and water infrastructure areas. So one of these areas means that, so there's 2 options. There's subdivision little I, and then on the next page is double I. So first, the residential connections and expansions are available to municipal water and direct and indirect discharge wastewater systems and not prohibited by state regulations or permits, identified capacity constraints, or municipally adopted service and capacity agreements. So if a town has that in their town, that is an area that could be defined as served by municipal water and sewer. Or it means an area established by the municipality by ordinance or bylaw that exclude flood hazard or inundation areas as established by statute, river corridors or fluvial erosion areas as established by statute, shorelands, and wherever year-round residential development is not allowed. Reflect identified service limits established by state regulations or permits, identified capacity constraints, or municipally adopted service and capacity agreements. On to page 6, exclude areas served by water and sewer to address identified community scale public health hazard or environmental hazards. Exclude areas serving a mobile home park that is not within an area planned for year-round residential growth. Exclude areas serving an industrial site or park. Exclude areas that where service lines are located to serve the areas described above, but no connections or expansions are permitted. Or, this is a big catch-all, modify the zoning provisions allowed under this chapter in areas served by indirect discharge designed for less than 100,000 gallons per day. Municipally adopted areas served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure that limit water and sewer connections and expansions shall not result in the unequal treatment of housing by discriminating against year-round residential use or housing type otherwise allowed in this chapter. So let me just take a step back and tell you what was happening here. The Senate Economic Development Committee was looking for a way to require certain areas to become more dense. And so the metric they chose were areas that have municipal sewer and water infrastructure. In working on this, we have found that there is not necessarily complete mapping. And so it isn't necessarily, there is a lot of mapping that's been done of these areas, but it isn't as simple as just mapping the area. There was also testimony that there are constraints on these existing systems as well. And some of the systems may include areas where the town has already predetermined where no connections can be added. So this subsection sets up the ability of the town to delineate for itself what is meant by sewer and water service area, so that they have some ability to define which areas are ready to have this additional growth. And so they can either sort of go with the first one, which is more basic, what are the areas that have expansions, that there's expansion and connections available that are ready for this growth, that aren't constrained by state permits or water capacity issues. The second option has more flexibility for the municipality to define by ordinance or bylaws areas that may have additional constraints in them, like flood hazard areas and river corridors, or areas that the town already has decided residential development isn't allowed at all, or other areas where there are more isolated and that additional capacity could lead to sprawl. So the second option gives town more flexibility. It isn't full flexibility. There are certain criteria that can be used to exclude areas from this increased density. But the overarching provision is at the end on page 6, which is if they go through this exercise and define these areas, they cannot use this exercise to discriminate against housing.
Question, why can't a discharge for less than 100,000 gallons per day, where's that threshold come from?
Can't really tell you.
Okay.
This language was compromise language that was worked on with some of the planners. I really cannot speak to size of wastewater treatment facilities or indirect charges. So I'm sure that there are witnesses who could tell you, but yeah.
Okay. Questions on to section 3?
All right, section.
Senator White.
I'm just a little confused about IV, that section.
Mhm.
Exclude areas serving a mobile home park that it's not within an area planned for year-round residential growth.
Yes, and so an example of this may include a mobile home park that is situated in a flood hazard area.
Which seems to be most of them in our area,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yes, and so notwithstanding that there is a mobile home park that already has been constructed, if the rest of the area has not been zoned for residential growth.
Okay,
And so that this is specific to when there's a mobile home park and the water and sewer line already goes out to them. But the municipality is not accepting additional connections outside of the mobile home park.
okay, so can I use an example? So let's say we have Tall Timbers or Alcott Park in our district. They could still add additional manufactured homes or upgrade or add do whatever they'd like to do in that park, as long as it's not outside of the residential growth area as well.
So I will just say that this language itself is not being used to make any changes to how connection permits are issued or make zoning decisions.
Okay.
But the earlier sections of this bill dictate where the municipality has to allow additional density.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, so
I
this
get
is
what
weird list here.
It's like
Yeah.
thank you. Fun.
So I think back in actually 50, one of the things we looked at was free, I think, was adequate water and sewer, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're not, even if you're not subject to that, is the town allowed to decline connection because it doesn't have additional capacity?
Yes. Yes, and that is, and as originally drafted, there was interest in not letting the towns use this as a weapon to get out of density by, they have this increased density that they have to allow. So there was intent from the committee to not let them stop issuing permits. So the town can state if there are constraints on the system and may adjust the geographic boundaries of the area, but the developer will still have the potential ability to put in septic if a wastewater connection permit hasn't been issued by the town. So if a developer is able to address the wastewater issue themselves, the town is going to have to allow that development. All right, section 3 relates to homeless shelters. So at the bottom of page 6, I guess I'll read you this list because this is about homeless shelters, but 24 VSA 4413 is another limitation on how towns can adopt their zoning bylaws. And so on the bottom of page 6, subsection A, the following uses may be regulated only with respect to location, height, building bulk, yards, courts, setbacks, density of buildings, off-street parking, loading facilities, traffic, noise, lighting, landscape, and screening requirements, and only to the extent that those regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. And so there's an existing list here, and state owned buildings, public and private schools, churches, hospitals, solid waste facilities, hazardous waste facilities. That's an existing list of types of uses that the town has a limited subset of criteria that it can regulate under. Regular zoning land use permits have a lot of aspects of a property that can be regulated. And so this is a smaller list of things that a town can actually regulate for these types of facilities. And it's adding to this list emergency shelters, which is defined on the next page, but we are basically talking about homeless shelters here. And additionally, on page 8, there's language related to this, which says, for the purpose of this subsection, regulating the daily or seasonal hours of operation of an emergency shelter shall constitute interfering with the intended functional use.
Not that that's ever come up.
Okay, thank you.
So they're not to regulate at all?
Correct.
Yes.
So section 4, yes, that is a pretty substantial change.
I hear from the towns.
I think so. Yes. So on page 4, there's updates to the definitions. And so I'll jump quickly to first the emergency shelter, since we just talked about it. So here, emergency shelter means any facility, the primary purpose of which is to provide a temporary shelter for the homeless in general, or for specific populations of the homeless, and that does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements. So this is the definition that was requested by the agencies who work on this. So DCF worked on this, and they requested this definition because this is the HUD definition that is used for the grants from the federal government. And so that's why people have asked regularly why it's emergency and not homeless. This is the federal definition that's being used. But it does specifically apply to homeless shelters.
Thank you.
So going back to, and just as a related aside, emergency shelter is defined elsewhere in different parts of statute to have a different meaning. Under our declared state of emergency statutes, there's a separate definition, and that is different. But here, we use this definition, which is homeless shelter. So the other definitions in this section that are being added, the definition of accessory dwelling unit, which is defined on the prior section, but here we're adding a cross-reference because it wasn't in the definition section. Sort of a style issue that the editors raised. And then this bill is adding definitions for duplex and multi-family and multi-unit dwelling. And so again, duplex is being defined and it has a specific definition. Whether or not it conjures different images in your head is not important because it's being defined here to be a residential building that has 2 dwelling units within the same building, and neither unit is an accessory dwelling unit. So it does not refer exclusively to a building that has 2 equal-sized units. The units can be of either size, but it is when there are 2 units in a building.
But not an ADU.
But not an ADU.
Which feels interesting.
And then finally, subsection 41, multi-unit or multifamily dwelling is a building that contains 3 or more dwelling units in the same building.
Okay. Perfect, so, let's stop at page 9, and we'll pick up on Tuesday. Thank you very much.